Hello and welcome to Exit Pursued by a Podcast, the theatre history podcast where we discuss all the minutiae of the theatre world. I'm your host, Evey Wylde, and I'm joined today by Hailey... Oh no, I'm tripping up on the last name again. Not again.
Bachrach.
Bachrach, there we go. Thanks for joining us, Hailey. How's it going?
It's going good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm always delighted to talk about theater and theater history. So this is going to be really good fun.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. So I am a Shakespeare scholar, I guess is the only way to put it. I'm currently, exactly. The most pretentious thing you could possibly call yourself. I am currently about to finish a postdoc at University of Roehampton on a project called Shakespearean Consent. And prior to that, I did my PhD in collaboration with the Globe. And before that, had a brief and unsuccessful career trying to be in theater in various capacities before, apparently deciding to live out the those who can't do teach adage. So a sort of performance studies Shakespeare blend, which I hope will come in useful for our subject today.
Fantastic. Okay, so I have asked you to come on to talk about the subject that makes many a Shakespearean roll their eyes and cringe just slightly. So thank you for indulging me. Do you want to introduce the topic?
We are going to be talking about the Shakespeare authorship, quote unquote, controversy today. I think you'll probably give a little bit of a preview here, but I would say we're going to be talking more about the sort of history of it as a conspiracy rather than indulging in treating it like a real thing.
Yes. To call a spade, it is pretty much a conspiracy theory in that it's one that pretty much no experts actually think hold any water. But so it's very much experts say it's not real, but people will believe it anyway.
Yeah, basically. And, there are degree programs dedicated to it, which I find shocking. So, there is, oh yes, one of them in my own hometown of Portland, Oregon, I'm ashamed to say. And there's at least one somewhere in the UK. I don't understand how you could possibly have an entire degree course on one subject, but especially when that subject isn't real. But they do exist. So there are, pockets of people who are scholars who believe this and teach it to other people.
That floors me that there's entire degrees based around. I can't even imagine the modules.
Well, right? What do you because you can't teach, we'll get into this, but it's you can't teach them early modern history because then you'll start undermining your own point. We need to send somebody to go undercover into one of these courses and figure out what they're up to.
Yes. And you can't teach them critical thinking either, because then they'll start to see the holes in the whole premise.
Exactly. So you're very, I don't know what you do. Maybe it's just a creative writing course in disguise.
Possibly. Or it's lots of people just who want to be Shakespeare coming in a rough.
Ooh, yeah. It teaches you how to suggest that perhaps you were Shakespeare.
Yes. It's a Shakespeare cosplay course.
Now I'm in favor of it.
That sounds
hugely down for that. I will say that whenever I'm talking to my dad about my career, the advice that he gives me is I should forge some documents. So maybe it's something along those lines. He's you should say that you found, Shakespeare's memoirs.
I feel like that's a very dad thing. Okay, so the Shakespeare authorship debate is, loosely speaking, the conspiracy that somebody else or a collection of somebody's was Shakespeare and wrote his works.
That's pretty much the essence of it. It comes down to the ideas, basically, that the evidence that we have supporting the idea that the works of Shakespeare were written by William Shakespeare, the Glover's son from Stratford-upon-Avon, is unconvincing for some reason, either because they feel Shakespeare's education and background don't plausibly sort of reflect the education that would have been required to create the works that he created, the idea that the works refer to things that Shakespeare never experienced or couldn't have known somehow, or simply a fundamentally classist idea that someone like him from a kind of middle class background could not possibly have written plays as wonderful as these.
That is very elitist.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, we'll get on to kind of where it is today, but can we talk about where it started? So I think it started with the
Absolutely.
Romantics.
More or less, yeah. We sort of begin to see it emerging in the 19th century, actually, in America, which I feel like is an element of it that many of the current like generation of anti-Stratfordians, as we sometimes call them, would hate. They don't want an American import. They want this to be, all natural British conspiracy. But yeah, it sort of came out of this era where some of the ideas around like authorship and art are really about, the idea that art comes from the self and the soul, and someone who is writing works of genius like Shakespeare's, because that's the other element of this is an era when Shakespeare
Mm.
is, probably at the peak of his fame and what we call bardolatry. Like he's treated like a god of literature. So the idea that like to achieve that, you have to have been an extraordinary person. And the biographical kind of facts of Shakespeare's life are not all that extraordinary and are in fact like more than mundane, even a little sordid in terms of like things he did to get money and, ambitions that he seems to have had. And so there was this sense of disconnect that in an era where kind of who you are and what you make were seen as like so intrinsically linked, people kind of were beginning to feel like this just doesn't add up. This doesn't make sense.
So it really was a case of people just finding Shakespeare's actual story unsatisfying.
Basically.
From how other authors' biographies looked at the time, or at least how they were presented.
And also a bit of, like I said, the 18th century. So like, before the kind of generation before this is when this sense of like bardolatry, as I called it, begins to emerge. So there's people kind of even at the time who are saying like, partly this emerges from the fact that like we have elevated Shakespeare so high, like what ordinary person could possibly seem fit to have like inhabited this role of the genius that we have also invented.
Well, I have a story about this actually. A while ago, a peer at university was giving a bit of an informal talk about Taylor Swift and how her music encourages fans to look for clues and use creative problem solving. Now, I'm taking this next quote slightly out of context, but I just kind of love it. She said that Taylor Swift could write all of Shakespeare's works, but Shakespeare could never. I really think this is an interesting example of the type of public figure that people want and maybe even expect to be held to the level that Shakespeare is. Someone whose life and drama is very well known and who leaves hidden messages in their work.
Absolutely. That's such a good, like, not to completely derail before we've even begun, but I do think that like that is a shared link in so many, perhaps all conspiracy theories, this yearning for a feeling of connecting the dots for yourself. Yeah. And someone like Taylor Swift, sometimes she's leaving those clues and sometimes the fans are, inventing things. But, it's really similar with like anti-Stratfordians kind of sifting through the plays, trying to find these clues. I've watched like documentaries about like flat earth conspiracy theorists who similarly like, I went through the science and I found this for myself. It's something about this sense of like ownership and discovery that for some reason pursuing these questions in a sort of more of standard academic route doesn't scratch that same itch for them. Something about the kind of rebelliousness of like, I did it myself, but there's absolutely something in that. And that has been like an element of the authorship conspiracy from the beginning. The person who's kind of credited with starting it in some ways is an American woman named Delia Bacon. No relation to Sir Francis Bacon, though that is the person that she suggested probably wrote the plays.
Yes, I'm sure that had no connection at all.
I mean, she kind of, her theory was a little more sprawling and complex. She kind of thought it was this like network of aristocrats that then with time kind of got winnowed down to Bacon. But she went on this whole like pilgrimage to Stratford to like find evidence. And like, that's always kind of been part of it, is this like literary expeditionary spirit.
I love that spirit in and of itself, but it feels a little bit misplaced. Like there are areas where it can be applied, I am sure.
I absolutely agree. It's like, why not spend that energy, like, reading through parish records of, finding like actual evidence rather than inventing it.
Okay, so we've discussed a little bit about some of the theories of identity, but let's take a moment to have a chat about some of the evidence and findings that supporters of the authorship debate use.
to break down sort of like authorship controversy 101, as it were, like we've sort of already said, it's the idea that somebody who wasn't Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. There are a few main categories. We have the sort of like aristocratic web of people. The Earl of Oxford, Oxfordians, you might have heard them called, is like the popular one right now. There's a lot of deeper level conspiracies beyond that, including that he was actually Elizabeth's illegitimate child, which I believe is the plot of the movie Anonymous. Another like common one in that sort of realm is Francis Bacon. That was more popular kind of in the early days of the authorship conspiracy. Similar ideas that there's like these kind of hints and clues, and like clearly has to have been an educated person. So they have all these reasons why these are the people we've chosen. Another one, moving away from like the aristocratic, but into the he must have been educated. People think Christopher Marlowe wrote the plays. Now, those of you who are well informed may be thinking, hang on, didn't Marlowe die like 10 or so years before Shakespeare stopped writing plays? And the answer for these people is no.
That's just what they want you to think.
That's just what they want you to think because, and this is, you know, probably true, Marlowe was likely a spy. There's lots of conspiracy theories surrounding his death, and one of them is he didn't actually die. It was a fake. He went into hiding and continued writing under the pseudonym of Shakespeare to hide his identity. And then we also have this whole kind of quadrant of like lots of women, Mary Sidney, Amelia Lanier, Anne Hathaway, his wife, all with sort of varyingly dubious, some of them actually have connections to Shakespeare. Like people think that Amelia Lanier is maybe the subject of some of his sonnets. He has sort of like patronage connections to various different women that are thought to have written the plays, but those are a different form of wishful thinking over in that corner of the conspiracy.
So the evidence for this, I believe the bulk of it is saying that there's not much actual written evidence of Shakespeare when he was alive.
There's evidence and then there's absence of evidence. One of the forms of evidence that people will find is really like fine-tooth comb reading the plays and finding these things like, oh, that's a veiled reference to this thing. And that means blah, 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 blah. So getting very like code breaker, like, you know, I've found the secret hints within the texts themselves. And then, yeah, the other half is the idea that like, we don't have enough evidence of Shakespeare. There was a fire in Stratford-upon-Avon at the school that Shakespeare went to. So we don't have records that he went to school at all because we don't have any of the records from that time period. It's not only Shakespeare. We don't have the like records for. It's, you know, the fact that he didn't go to university. So how well educated could he possibly have been? The answer is very. Grammar school education at that time was quite intense. He didn't leave a library. How could somebody who makes all these literary references and clearly was drawing on other texts possibly have died without a library to leave to people? And the fact that there are just sort of like chunks of Shakespeare's life where we don't know, we have no record at all of kind of where he was or what he was doing. And from a modern perspective, that's like a bit suspicious. Like, how come we don't know anything about what you're doing from the time you got married at 18 to when you showed up at London in like 26? Like, that's where did it all go? But actually, when you compare Shakespeare to other playwrights of the period, like, I mean, we really have more about him because people have looked so hard for kind of evidence of his life. But the kind of gaps that exist in the record of his life are not as weird compared to other people as the kind of authorship conspiracy theorists would have you seem.
They very much need to be taken in the context of the time. Not everyone's going to have the same type of paper trails we have today, just because there wasn't even print media, really.
Yeah, it's also like, you know, records get destroyed. People didn't know they need to be saving every detail of Shakespeare's life. There's this anecdote I love. Shakespeare had two daughters, and one of them lived to be quite old. And I can't remember who it is, but there was some Shakespeare scholar, like it must have been late 1600s, post-Civil War. And he was like, oh, damn, I was going to go visit Susanna Shakespeare and like talk to her, but she just died.
Oh, well.
Like, so it was just this like mischance of like, he was, you know, he's like, yeah, I meant to go do that, but I never got around to it. Bummer. But, and it's just like, you know, he was just a guy.
So they probably weren't aware of how long lasting the legacy was going to be.
I mean, yeah, exactly. Like there's simply no way to know. Like Shakespeare is in sort of rarefied company in that not that many writers of the period had a collected folio of their plays the way that Shakespeare did. So, that was special. But the idea that someday people would expect that to be accompanied by his biography, yeah, was like a completely unexpected and unknowable concept.
I do also empathize quite strongly because I know that there is a strong desire for people to see themselves in these big cultural figures, especially ones that have had such a big impact on worldwide culture and literary culture, let alone just British. And when there was kind of a movement in, I think it was the 20th century, to kind of rediscover women or people of color who were very prolific of their time, I think trying to uncover details that our favorite authors or playwrights may have been more marginalized individuals and it was covered up is quite an interesting idea, but I feel like discovery in that area is a little bit misplaced. But I do understand the drive and the desire to see it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the sort of other half of not half, there's a million, there's a ton of different like candidates for who people who think Shakespeare is not Shakespeare think the works were written by. And there is like this totally classist, like Glover's son could never have written these plays. He must be an aristocrat or at least university educated sort of part of the theory. And those are the people who are suggesting, oh, it's Bacon, it's the Earl of Oxford, it's Christopher Marlowe. And then there's this other part that's tapping into the thing you're saying that's like, oh, what if it was Mary Sidney? What if it was Amelia Lanier? What if it was mostly kind of women of the period who, yeah, it comes sort of from this desire to be like, I think, to, yeah, like reclaim something, to kind of make this case that like Shakespeare is ours in some way.
Yeah.
Like, the yearning for the quote unquote greatest English playwright to be a woman sort of manifests that as true in some way.
Did you ever see the film Centurions 2 by any chance?
I can't say that I have, though in the like depths of my obsession with Colin Firth that I feel we all experience, I did almost watch it.
So Centurions 2 is, it's a film. It's got David Tennant in it as well. I'm going to spoil it all for you now. But
I accept that.
The part of the culmination of a conspiracy that happens within it is that Shakespeare was not only a woman, but was a pirate and the first centurion.
Ooh.
This was my first exposure to this idea, was in a comedy film about schoolgirls. And I think that there was the baddies were like just a group of misogynists called like the Women Haters or something like that, really on the nose.
I love that. I mean, and like not to take it too seriously, but it is reflecting this, the anti-establishment idea that is like how the sort of anti-Stratfordians love to see themselves, even the classist ones, as like, oh, the academic establishment is telling us how we can think and how to research and what facts mean. But we, are rebelling. And that, becomes a little more not plausible, but, understandable when it's like, they won't let me say that Shakespeare's a woman because they're misogynists. It's like, well, that's not why, but I get it.
Like, we could understand. I do empathize with the whole movement being quite anti-authority, because I don't know if I do trust universities as institutions to make information accessible. But again, it's just the aiming of the argument. There are genuine complaints here about the freedom of information and of scholarly research.
Absolutely. And so like the very best book on this subject is a book by James Shapiro called Contested Will. And it kind of is where I learned most of what I know about the kind of history of the conspiracy, the controversy, if you will. And I think that it just does such a great job of demonstrating the trying to like kind of draw the line between the legitimate accusations of kind of gatekeeping that are applied to the academic establishment, which are like, all super real, and the kind of like harder to argue but still true fact that like there are historical facts, there are like, skills that you can learn to be a good researcher that the average person may or may not have. And yes, there are resources that the average person doesn't have access to. And that is on some level unfair. And it's annoying that you kind of have to like trust the people who know how to read secretary hand, that the thing says the thing they say it does. But also it's like, these skills are real. These facts are real. Like history and literature, in fact, are like specialist areas where people learn how to do them well.
Yeah, I think it's also a little bit of a hangover from colonialized history
Absolutely.
of various facts and identities being suppressed. History is written by the victors. And because this has come to light that it was written by the victors and things were admitted, now we are a little bit sensitive about trying to find where those gaps may be. And
Absolutely.
as with the Taylor Swift argument, we can sometimes see clues where there may not actually be any. And that's where proper training on critical thinking really comes in to actually identify where these gaps are.
And again, it's so interesting that it's like this theory sits at, again, the center of a whole network of things. But again, some of them are coming from that sort of angle of like, this is a history that has been suppressed. Shakespeare was a woman, Shakespeare was a writer of color, all these things. And then this other half that's like, this is a history that's been suppressed. Shakespeare was an aristocrat. He's too good to have been one of these, poor people. Like, it's fascinating that like the same idea sits at the heart of like two kind of radically different philosophies, at least on the surface. But I think that like what we're getting at is like they're animated by this same desire to claim Shakespeare and to feel that they know Shakespeare.
Especially I feel like because a lot of his plays deal with very universal issues. So that once you have the in of getting into Shakespeare, pretty much everyone can find something that will make them feel something or that they'll be able to relate to. So being able to identify that again back to the author is an additional plus. And it's kind of like, if I can't relate to the person who wrote this, why am I relating to the material maybe?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think the idea of like Shakespeare's universality is one that like we could sit and debate for 500 years and is like a very like hot topic. But it's undeniable that many, many different kinds of people through history and across the world watch and read these plays and feel connected to them in some way, whether that's because of universality or whatever. There are things there that people relate to. And I think that that kind of helps move us into the 20th century kind of iteration of the conspiracy, which became much more concretely about the idea that like basically like write what you know, like the biography is essential to understanding a writer and their work. So how could Shakespeare, whose biography has nothing to do with anything he wrote about, possibly be the person who wrote these plays about these massive topics? And in a way, I think it's almost the opposite of the universality argument in some ways, like that the specificity of his experience was wrong. Like he couldn't have written about these things without experiencing them. They're not universal.
I really feel like this is the question where death of the author really does come into play, because if we sit back and we follow a thought experiment through, what impact would it have if Shakespeare had been a woman or had been an aristocrat? Would that change what we get from his works in a meaningful way, do you think?
That's such a great question. I remember a couple of years ago when like 10 years ago now, the new Oxford Shakespeare edition came out. And one of the sort of like radical things they did was they used kind of stylometrics, which is like, using data analysis to determine authorship, to make the case that several of Shakespeare's plays were not just collaborative, which is something we've long kind of assumed about, especially his early and late works, but to make the case that like, okay, we think like Christopher Marlowe wrote part of Henry VI, Part 1. Like these are the specific authors we're putting a name to that we think worked with Shakespeare on these plays. And that was like, to have that kind of enshrined in print in the Oxford Shakespeare was a very big deal, because these are the kind of things that are a big deal for us. And it came out right before Christmas. I remember it was at like a Christmas, event with some friends of my parents, and somebody asked me, like, I heard about this Marlowe thing. Like, what do you think? Do you think it's real? And I just remember saying, like, I think it is. I don't think it matters if it's correct or not, because it at least gives us an interesting lens through which to consider those plays. Like, it is interesting to read Henry VI, Part 1 and consider it a Marlowe play. That gives us a new way to think about the text. And maybe it's not, maybe we'll find out that it's not accurate, but it does give us something interesting. So I do understand that, like, yeah, in theory, I think if you are saying like a woman wrote these female characters or wrote these female characters who are often treated in these horrible ways, like, I guess that says something about how we understand the plays. But like, would it really give us more than what the plays are already giving? I realize that's a little bit the opposite of what I said with the Marlowe thing, but I do think that like the difference there is like we can consider that in a literary way. We're like, if we think of this as part of a corpus of other plays that Marlowe wrote, there's like connections to draw there. If we just say, you know, like Shakespeare was a woman, it's like, okay, well, the plays are still what they are. They say what they say.
Mhm. For me, it's different because it's theatre and they're plays. I know they're read in English class and you can read them as is, but they are intended and frequently used as performance texts. And the writer being a working middle class man in the 1600s doesn't stop female directors or new innovative diverse casting of different genders, different races, different social groups from putting their own influence on the works, because theatre is a work of collaboration. It's not just the work of a writer. It very much gets realized through different groups and progresses through time. So Shakespeare being a woman wouldn't necessarily give us anything more than Shakespeare produced by a woman in the 21st century. I don't know.
I think I love that. Yeah, I was, as you're saying that, I was like, yeah, gosh, if I was doing like The Taming of the Shrew and like was like, and it's by a woman, like yeah, that would change the marketing, but would it change anything about what I actually did with the play on stage? I don't think so. I don't think it can. I think the other thing as well is like we have a not inconsiderable amount of writing by women in that period. And that does not get the play from these people who claim to be seeking to elevate women's voices that Shakespeare does. Like people are obviously so much more invested in trying to make Shakespeare's voice into a woman's voice than they are actually seeing what actual women of the period were writing and doing and saying. And like the works of women like Amelia Lanier and Mary Sidney and these women who are authors who are said to be Shakespeare, like have so much to say in their own right. And like, you know, are interesting because they're the voices of women, but also are just interesting. Did you see the play Amelia that was at the Globe years back?
I don't think I was in London at the time, actually.
Yeah, it was at the Globe and then it was on the West End. And it basically is about the life of Amelia Bassanio, Amelia Lanier, who is a poet. Her family's of Venetian descent. It's possible that she was Black or, you know, had sort of a mixed race heritage, but we don't know. And she is one of the people some people think is Shakespeare. Some people think she's the Dark Lady of the sonnets, which is one of the kind of recurring figures in Shakespeare's sonnets who kind of pops up and was maybe a lover of his. And the play, you know, argues that she had this love affair with Shakespeare and she secretly kind of wrote all his best roles. And like, especially the women's parts, like that's hers. And it's just fascinating to have this play that's all about elevating women's voices and honoring this woman who was forgotten and suppressed. And I think there's maybe 5 lines of her actual poetry in the play.
Oh,
like,
no.
It's this chance to actually be like, look at this woman who had this amazing voice and wrote these insane, really cool poems, but instead it's like, but actually the only poetry that's good enough is Shakespeare's.
Yeah, it's kind of like hyper focusing on Shakespeare, who had such a big cultural impact, is distracting from women of the actual period or even today who are doing very remarkable work, which is maybe where the emphasis should be placed.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think if that's like the thing that draws you to this conspiracy, then the better way to, you know, honor women of this period is to like find ways to elevate the writing they actually did.
I think that needs to probably start with the writing in those figures, of only about like half of whom I've actually heard of. There needs to be some work in making their work more accessible and more kind of available for people.
And there's, you know, a big movement among lecturers, you know, especially at the kind of like undergraduate level to kind of like, yeah, put these women on the curriculum, like teach Mary Carey's The Tragedy of Miriam, which is this like wild biblical closet drama alongside Shakespeare, you know, like in addition to giving a bigger picture of like the world. Don't just have it be the fairy queen again and Othello again.
If you're going to teach Elizabethan drama, don't just do Shakespeare and Marlowe, include a wider range.
Yeah. And I think that there's, you know, been a lot of progress towards that. And like editions of women's writing is much more accessible than it has been in the past. We're working on it. We're moving towards it. But I also think that like that is how you combat this conspiracy is making people understand like the full breadth of experiences that people, and specifically like writers of this period, had, because this is the other problem with like this idolized version of Shakespeare being our only picture of the Elizabethan period. Is it's like if he doesn't live up to his own stereotype, then it's like, oh my gosh, wait, like how could this have happened and how could this have happened? But if you're like, oh, actually there were tons of writers living tons of different types of lives, it suddenly, the things that are supposedly like weird about Shakespeare's biography aren't that weird anymore.
I think it plays a little bit into my specialty, which is celebrity actors.
Yes.
Because Shakespeare, very much a celebrity.
Also an actor.
Also an actor, I was about to say. People forget about that bit so often. He was a very famous actor of the day, right up there with Richard Burbage. Burbage? Yes, Burbage.
Yeah.
I always get him confused with the guy that was in The Hobbit, Richard Armitage. I always get their names confused.
I'm putting it out here now. I've long thought that there needs to be a series about Shakespeare and Burbage's like friendship and like creative partnership. So I'm putting forward right now that Richard Armitage should play Richard Burbage in this series.
Yes.
I'm going to secret that into being.
I think it would be so lovely to see this as an example of early collaborative practice and kind of demystify the magnitude of the aura that Shakespeare has accumulated.
Exactly. And I think that this is the other thing as well to like bring it to the theater history angle, is that once you know anything about how the Elizabethan and Jacobean theater functioned, the idea that some aristocrat off somewhere who's never met the playing companies and isn't like there on the ground, like was like writing these plays in their study and like shipping them off to the theaters is absurd. Yeah. Like that just is not how it was. Deeply like collaborative and, you know, collaborating with other writers. The roles were being written for specific performers. So you can just tell when you sort of read, there's a kind of emerging, it's not that recent, but like semi-emerging category of study in the field that's called repertory studies. Instead of saying, we're going to look at the works of Shakespeare, we're going to look at like the works of the king's men. We're going to take these acting companies as the sort of author of these texts and look at that as the body of work. And when you do that, you start to see like, oh, these roles are being written clearly for the same actors who the writers all know super well. They like rely on the same bits. They know exactly which props are in the prop storage. So they know what kind of like stuff to put on stage. They know what costumes they have access to. Like the total kind of familiarity with the whole apparatus of how the companies were operating on a really granular level. Because again, the sort of root of the aristocratic version of the authorship controversy is, oh, that it would be shameful to write for the public theater. So they had to use a pseudonym and they couldn't. And it's like, well, but you can't have done it if you weren't immersed in and part of this industry.
There is a bit of divorcing Shakespeare and his works from the reality that it was a theatre company.
Absolutely.
And they were collaborative productions. And that's part of the problem with just studying in English class and approaching it initially from that perspective of words on a page, is you lose that context.
Absolutely.
And what you were saying about being written for actors, I was trying to remember because this has come up in my own studies. He was one of the clowns, one of the fools, one of the comic actors, and he died partway through and he was replaced by someone else and it completely changed how those roles were written.
Yeah, so it was Will Kemp was Shakespeare's first clown, and he played, we think, roles like Dogberry in Much Ado About Nothing and Lancelot Gobbo in Merchant of Venice, and like these kind of dumb, goofy clowns who often like their thing is like they say the wrong word or they mean the wrong thing. And then he left the company for reasons that are unclear, went on a he Morris danced for 9 days straight, like traveling through England. It was a whole thing. And he was replaced by Robert Armin, who then takes on roles like Touchstone, probably the Fool in Lear, like much more kind of cerebral clown/fool types. And yeah, as you say, if you read the plays kind of in what we think is chronological order, knowing this, you can see this it's immediate distinct shift in like the funny guys are doing one thing in these plays and then they start doing a totally different thing.
And that kind of goes back to the collaborative nature of the theatre in this time period, as it is today. But by attributing all of that credit to one man, ironically, you kind of lose some of that context. So even if Shakespeare was a woman or was a person of color or was queer or whatever kind of identity, it wouldn't necessarily take away from the impact of the actors, producers, audiences that also very much impacted what we now have from the folios.
Absolutely. And, Shakespeare's company had a unique for the time structure, and that, well, by the sort of 1590s, they were in this kind of shareholder structure. There was this group of owners, and Shakespeare is one of them, and the others were the other actors. And so it's like they had a really direct say in like what was going on in the company, and one imagines, and like the types of roles that were getting written for them, and like the types of plays that were getting performed. And so, yeah, it's just sort of inextricable from the whole sort of network of the company itself. And it just trickles down once I so agree with you that it's like this has to be taught more as like your introduction to Shakespeare, because it informs every part of the play. You see it in the way that like and again, this is something that like the Earl of Oxford would never know if he's like off in his manor house, is like you will see that often the role of an actor and his apprentice will be paired throughout the plays. So like there will be like often a female role or a child role that kind of follows an adult role through the whole play. And we think that this is like a master apprentice structure, so that the master could like help the apprentice like learn those scenes and like make sure that they kind of knew what they were doing throughout the play.
Oh,
And you'll
that's
often
really
see
cool.
yeah, and like you'll have to see like over the course of the play, the role gets more difficult as the play goes on. So they start out like only kind of following someone else on stage, but then like kind of by the end, they might get one scene where they like enter alone, and it's like, okay, you've like had the whole play to warm up. Now you get your moment.
Oh, that's so cute. Oh,
Yeah.
I love that. We should have more plays where that structure's written in.
Right. Yeah. This kind of like built-in like training wheels role.
Yeah.
And like, if you don't have this kind of intimate familiarity of like who is whose apprentice, and like, well, who do I need to be pairing up, and like which apprentice is ready for how big of a role, like how could you possibly?
Exactly. And the actors were obviously contracted with the King's Men and the Globe, but they were also active in the coffee houses of the
Mm,
time. They were out among people, kind of spreading their
yeah.
image. I think it was Will Kemp who was the first actor to be put on a pub sign.
Oh, really?
That is one of the first instances we have of an actor attaining a celebrity status.
I love that.
So these reputations were very much about. So the audiences of the time were aware of kind of how things were progressing. To my knowledge, please do
Absolutely.
correct me if I'm wrong.
No,
I
no,
am not
no. I think
Shakespearean.
no, no, no. I didn't know that about Kemp. I completely believe it. He was incredibly famous. And yeah, it's absolutely true. You can see like chances again, like you'll see these moments of the Robert Armin clown roles that are like his bits, like his famous comedy bits. And they often kind of stand out in the play because you're like, what? This has nothing to do with anything, but it's like, oh no, that's an Armin thing that people would like want to get to see him do.
Like a catchphrase. So, like, if you see a film with Matthew McConaughey, you expect to hear him say, all right, all right, all right. Or the expectation for Samuel L. Jackson to drop motherfucker at least once. It's disappointing if they don't.
Yeah, like what was the point of that role if we don't get to see that? Exactly. And it is like I said before, like the idea that Shakespeare collaborated with other people on his plays is like very controversial and like offensive to some people. But in the sort of opposite way of the authorship controversy of just saying, no, he wasn't this lone genius, the best writer ever. He was part of a community and a network of people, and he existed in a world. And it would actually be impossible to lift him out of that world and say, oh no, these plays emerged completely separate from this industry and this community and this culture.
I think one sense of collaboration is a mystery and it's something to be uncovered, whereas the other one is more mundane, it's more
Yeah.
understandable, it's less narratively satisfying than
Yeah.
uncovering a collaboration that's been kept under the rug for so long. But I think the reality could be just as interesting. Like you get so many internet investigators who will go into like the nitty gritty of, say, an actor's or just an influencer's career and all the little things they've done. I'm sure you can do that for the actors in the collaborative process and kind of pull out the strands. I'm sure Shakespeareans have, to be honest, and it's just not reached me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a mix of things, right? It's that like accessing those records is not easy, and it's not, again, like they are literally written in something called secretary hand, which to a modern eye is completely illegible. So you have to learn to read possibly Latin, and even the ones that are in English, like a different language, essentially. It's easier than that. But like the bar to entry in terms of just like basic skills is quite high. I would love to be able to go over to St. Leonard's Shoreditch, where Burbage and his family are buried, and just go through their historic records. But like, I am garbage at secretary-hand, so I can't do it. So it is this idea that like, I think it gets back to what I was saying before. It's like there's a feeling of gatekeeping. And I guess in some ways there is some gatekeeping happening, but it is simply the gatekeeping of these are the skills you need to do this thing. Whereas it's quite easy to like go to Westminster Abbey and be like, ooh, see, this symbol on Bacon's grave is the same as this symbol. And that means that he's actually Queen Elizabeth's secret lover.
It's very Da Vinci Code.
It gets very Da Vinci Code in certain areas.
We're presented these ways of investigating and uncovering conspiracies in media that are very, if you just turn the symbol the right way up or squint at it a little bit, you too could solve a mystery. Unfortunately, the world just isn't that fun, and that's not really how it works in practice.
I think and again, it like connects back to these different layers of like, the thing that people always say, it's like academics refuse to say that like these two corpses found, literally having sex in a grave were gay. And it's like, no, they don't refuse to say that. There's just a different standard of evidence. And like, there's like things that don't occur to someone who hasn't studied these fields to think about. And so it's like, genuinely, historically, academia, I mean, it still is, has been bigoted and prejudiced and has hid histories that don't fit a certain kind of Eurocentric white male model. But also sometimes the layperson actually doesn't know better. And the academics actually are the ones who have all the information needed to make sense of a situation because they have developed certain skills that not everybody has.
No, absolutely. I feel like at times the fact that academia is at least trying to get better is not given much airtime, but there are concerted efforts at play to improve access and diversify approaches.
I mean, and, insert tangent about the academic precarity and whether that will, continue to be true when all of the real academics doing incredibly important, interesting, diverse work don't have jobs. But it's absolutely true. And again, it's like it's just things on the level of like, I think if I told my parents, like, do you know what secretary-hand is? Do you know that if you went to a random Elizabethan document, you wouldn't be able to read it? Like, I don't think people know that. And so it seems to them like, oh, well, of course I can just find all this information and it's all just there on the internet and like easy to access and I can put together my own theory.
I think the ease of access to information on the internet is part of what has stoked some distrust as well, because we have so much that is easy to access. But there are still things that, a layperson can't access to. I was talking to Natalie Winter a few weeks ago about stage combat in Elizabethan times, funnily enough. And we were talking about how still today the catalogues on the actual stage combat and how to train it are written in a way that isn't accessible to just anyone. You have to have certain qualifications in order just to look at them and be able to read them. Yeah. So there is still some gatekeeping, but I don't know if it's entirely intentional or it's just kind of come about through time and we haven't been able to put anything in place yet.
I will never understand why the security to get an access to the British Library is more intense than getting access to like the Vatican. But, it's absolutely the like way that resources are held back. And I also think that I remember not that long ago, sort of during the pandemic, like every theater was like filming things and putting it online. And then suddenly people were like, why doesn't every theater do that all the time? And it's like, because it's insanely expensive and hard to do. And same with like, why don't we just digitize everything? It's like, because it's insanely expensive and hard to do. So there's, reasons that things aren't as accessible perhaps as they could be. But yeah, absolutely. People are always going to feel like, I can't see that document. What are you hiding from me?
They're highlighting that Taylor Swift wrote all of Shakespeare's works.
This is what I came on here today to say. Taylor Swift, much like Christopher Marlowe, is a vampire. And
have you seen the film Only Lovers Left Alive?
No, but I had this proposal I was working on for a project that won't happen now about Marlowe. And one of the things, what I really wanted one of the chapters to be, why do so many things say Marlowe is a vampire? Because it's also in A Discovery of Witches, that series, Marlowe's a vampire. Like
I kind of love that. It feels like a running joke.
Yeah.
More than anything else, just like an inside joke, because in Only Lovers Left Alive, it's John Hurt playing Marlowe, who of course knows about this, who I doubt believes that Christopher Marlowe wrote Shakespeare's works and
I actually think he
alive.
is an anti-Stratfordian.
Wait, I don't think he was?
I think so. I don't think he thinks Marlowe's a vampire, but I do think that he didn't think Shakespeare was Shakespeare. Maybe Derek Jacobi definitely believes that. And I think John Hurt did too, but I don't want to slander him.
John.
Don't take that one. I'm not sure of. So don't, asterisk.
I will fact check. Hello, Editing Evey here. I've had a look and there are some interviews in which John Hurt does say that he believes that Shakespeare's works were written by somebody else, potentially by Marlowe, which is fitting because these quotes are from the 2013 Cannes Film Festival on a panel for Only Lovers Left Alive. He's very chilled out about it, and it made me realise that we've been talking about people who believe in this theory as almost wearing tinfoil hats and being on the same level as flat earthers, but I don't think that's necessarily a fair depiction. Although we do believe that this is still something of a conspiracy theory, sharing many of the same qualities as some other more harmful ones, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that the purpose of this episode is to examine the controversy rather than to trash talk anybody who believes it, because that just feels a little bit mean. Back to the episode.
Yeah, I think that, I was joking before about I really want a film about, Shakespeare and Burbage's friendship, but even setting aside how much that there definitely is to explore academically, there's whole archives from this period that no one's looked at. Not that long ago, well, it might be a couple of years ago now, actually, someone found new evidence about the application Shakespeare made to get a coat of arms for his family. And all of this sort of conversation around it was oh yeah, everyone was just too bored to go through those records with a fine-tooth comb the way that the person who found it did. It was there, but nobody could be bothered. So, it's there's stuff there to find, but also just in a pop culture way and a narrative way, there are awesome stories to tell and imagine about this really dynamic, vibrant, competitive, creative industry that is, at the time Shakespeare begins writing, he and Marlowe and Burbage and Edward Allen, the other most famous actor of the time, are 22, so it's there's so much there, even just in a pop culture way that is so much more interesting than the stories we get about what if Oxford was Elizabeth's what if Amelia Lanier was just abused by all the men in her life all the time,
in some ways I don't think history always needs to be yassified.
Yes.
I say this because look, it's been made into a series recently. It's quite popular, a lot of people like it, and you're allowed to like it, absolutely fine, but My Lady Jane,
is it Jane Grey or Jane Seymour?
Jane Grey, Queen for 9 days.
So it's going to end in horrific tragedy.
No, this is reimagined of what if she was a girl boss and survived.
Oh, okay. I don't know if I feel ready to go on the record as hating Six as much as I do.
Do it.
But the idea that all these women needed to avoid tragedy was just to be more of a girl boss is so deeply offensive to me. I find the closing number of 6 where it's oh my God, I just said no to my music teacher who raped me, and now I'm a girl boss, is just it makes me furious. Almost as furious as the authorship conspiracy. I've held it down, but I do hate this and it makes me really mad. And
I thank you for coming on to talk to me about it, despite that anger, that very deep-rooted anger.
Not at all, not at all. It's, I think that it's a silly thing on one level to get mad about, but I think that any conspiracy theory like it that encourages people to reject facts and encourages people to think the historical record is not real, objective things about history and the past and the world are not true, is a dangerous way to teach people to think. It's the same rejection of expertise that leads to climate change denial and leads to COVID denial and leads to much bigger and more dangerous types of conspiracy. And I think that it, is maybe makes me sound paranoid and crazy to say oh, these things are connected. But I really just do see the same kind of fundamental mistrust that there are people who are experts in something and know things that is the root of so many quite dangerous conspiracies.
Absolutely. I think that's kind of getting to the root of what we want to say with this episode. I mean, I don't want to speak for you, but I think the kind of core is what we're saying is that we understand some of the issues that this debate and this conspiracy does stem from. We understand the systemic distrust. We understand the desire to see ourselves in powerful figures. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we should completely dive down the rabbit hole without taking into account things that experts who may have been studying this for a long time or maybe more knowledgeable are pointing out. Not all experts are the devil. Not all experts are out to get you and out to hide things and out to manipulate you. Most out there to educate people and just to find out more about, in this particular case, history and Shakespeare and what we can get from the reality and how it can continue to be preserved today.
Absolutely. And I think that the sort of lesson still for Shakespeareans and, well-informed fans of Shakespeare is to just always avoid this idolatrous image of Shakespeare and try instead to put out into the world the idea that like the Elizabethan and Jacobean eras were these commercial, chaotic, collaborative, much weirder, and yet much more like our own time, kind of time and place, and therefore a world in which the Shakespeare who existed actually is very integrated and lives quite comfortably and is not some magical exception. And that it was a world with many women who were writing, women who were working in the theater, even if it was not on stage or necessarily writing. There's so many anonymous plays out there that God only knows. And, it was a world that was diverse and was vibrant and creative and interesting. And just because Shakespeare wasn't those things, it does not mean the Elizabethan era wasn't those things.
Do you have any advice for people who are looking for Elizabethan type era, Shakespeare-esque women or queer writers or writers of color or anything like that who may want to dabble into that?
So my mentor, Will Tosh, just has a book out called Straight Acting, which is about basically the queer culture of Elizabethan England and how Shakespeare did, in his argument, fit into that world, and that there was this kind of sense of not a queer identity the way we think of it today, but absolutely a sort of culture of same-sex like love and romance in the Elizabethan period and Jacobean period. He highlights some other writers who kind of delved into those subjects more explicitly. Richard Barnfield, I think, is one of the main ones, a very gay sonneteer. I would say this play, The Tragedy of Miriam, that I mentioned by Mary Carey, is just really interesting. A woman writing plays not for the stage, but probably for private performance. The poetry of Amelia Lanier is wild, all about wanting to have sex with Jesus.
Wow, that is wild.
Yeah, a tried and true, erotic religious genre. It's, like she is a lot of the things that like people are looking for and trying to make Shakespeare into, in terms of being like a kind of woman's perspective on subjects and questions of the era. Yeah. And then just like on this topic generally, like I said, James Shapiro's book, Contested Will, is a fantastic overview of the history of this. And in the final chapter kind of breaks down, okay, here's the evidence. Here is why we just know that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare.
Brilliant. I will link all of those in the show notes for the listeners' ease of accessing them. And I think that brings us to the end of the episode. Thank you so much for listening. Hailey, thank you so much for being on. If people want to find you on the internet or anywhere else, where can they find you?
You can find me on the dying corpse of Twitter, H. Bachrach. I do technically have a newsletter, which is not updated in quite some time, but it is shakespeare.substack.com, going through Shakespeare's plays kind of character by character and thinking about the text in that way. There's like several things. My current project that I mentioned, Shakespearean Consent, has a website, shakespeareanconsent.com. It is eventually going to host sort of companion guides to all of Shakespeare's plays, kind of looking at them through a lens of like gender and sexuality and consent and race and sort of like urgent political topics to help performers specifically kind of think through those issues in relation to the plays. And finally, I have a book, Staging Female Characters in Shakespeare's English History Plays, which came out from Cambridge University Press at the beginning of this year. So these are all the things if you feel like learning more about my work.
As for us, you can follow us also on the dying corpse of Twitter at EPB_pod. If you have any comments or would like to join the discussion, you can leave us a comment or a tweet on there or send us an email at epbpod@gmail.com. All information sources and references, as well as some further reading should you be interested, can be found in the show notes. Thank you once again for listening. We upload every other Sunday afternoon, so join us next time. I'm not quite sure what the episode will be yet, but I'll probably be good, so you should stick around for that. Okay, have a good one. Bye.